I was the one who scrubbed the floor after. That's my statement, if anyone's still writing these down. I was the one with the bucket. I want that on record before I tell you about the girl, because everyone remembers the girl, and nobody remembers that someone had to clean the stone before her 37 times, and that the water never quite ran clear by the end of the month. I had calluses from the brush. I had a name once that the guards used. Now I'm just the one who scrubbed. So when I tell you she walked in and sat down, you should know what the floor looked like first. You should know what she was sitting on. The chamber is round. No windows. They bricked the last one over 9 years ago, after a challenger went through it trying to escape, and the noise that followed was worse than anything that came before. The torches gutter low on purpose. The king's men like the dark in there. They say it keeps the things inside calmer. I think it just keeps us from having to look too closely. 37 men and women went through that door, believing they would be the one. A sword, a spear, bare hands, a vial of wolfsbane smuggled in a boot. I saw all of it confiscated, all of it tried anyway when the guards weren't looking, all of it useless. The door is oak banded in iron, 3 inches thick, and even through it you can hear when something has gone wrong inside. It's a specific sound. I won't describe it for you. I scrubbed enough of what came after. Number 37 was a boy, 19, with a chipped front tooth from a fall off a hay cart when he was 11. He told me that himself, waiting his turn, like the detail might matter to somebody. He went in loud. They mostly go in loud, singing war chants, screaming the king's name like a curse, trying to make their own fear into noise so it has somewhere to go. He came out in less than 4 minutes. I was already filling the bucket. That was the night before the girl came. Her name, I learned after, was Fia, and the first thing anyone noticed about her, before the calm, before any of it, was the silver scar that ran from her left ear down into her collar, old and pale, the kind of mark that stopped being a wound and become a fact about a person's neck. She didn't hide it. Some women angle their hair to cover a thing like that. She didn't. She arrived on foot. No escort, no banner, no sword. She carried a satchel that looked like it held bread and not much else. And she stood at the registration table where the steward, a narrow man named Joran Vell, who keeps the challenger ledger and has a tremor in his right hand from drink, though he'll tell you it's old age, looked up at her like she'd wandered in off the wrong road. Name, he said. Fia. House? Nen. He almost laughed. Almost. Then why are you here? She didn't answer that one. Not then. People assume silence is fear. I watched her face while Joran's pen scratched her name onto the ledger under 37 crossed-out others, and I can tell you, it wasn't fear. It was something flatter than fear. Something that had already happened to her once, somewhere else, and had nothing left to take. I should tell you what's behind that door, since you've come this far wanting to know. They call him the Beast. They call him the King's Curse, the King's second self, the thing the court keeps fed and chained and occasionally lets out to prove a point. What they don't say loudly, what you have to be in the castle long enough to hear in corners, is that the Beast has a name too, and it's Edric. And Edric used to sit a throne and laugh at his own jokes before something happened to him that nobody will name above a whisper. I didn't know any of that the night Fia walked the corridor to the chamber door. I only knew the smell that came under it. Wet fur, old blood, something feral that didn't belong inside stone walls, and the sound, the low constant sound, like a kettle that's been left on a fire too long and forgotten. She stopped in front of the door. The guards waited for her to ask for a weapon. Every single one of the 37 had asked for a weapon. She didn't. You'll want something, the guard captain said. Hesh. His name was a big man, one ear missing entirely, lost to frostbite a winter before I came to the castle, just a smooth pucker of scar where the ear should sit. Even the fast ones want something. I won't, Fia said, and she went in. I want you to sit with that door for a second the way I had to. 3 inches of oak and iron. On the other side of it, something that had taken 37 people apart in the space of a season, and a woman with bread in her satchel and an old scar on her neck, walking toward it like it was an appointment she'd already decided to keep. The guards waited for the sound. It didn't come. What I am about to tell you happened across one season in a castle most maps don't bother naming. In a year nobody important enough to track wrote down. I wasn't in the room for all of it. Nobody was, except the two of them. And one of them couldn't speak for himself for most of it, and the other one didn't talk much even when she could. But I scrubbed that floor for 9 years before her, and I never had to scrub it again after, and that has to mean something. So let me tell you what I've pieced together. From her, a little, in the rare evenings she'd sit with the kitchen staff and let her guard down an inch. From Hesh, who stood outside that door more nights than any man should. From the parts I saw myself. Hauling water, keeping my head down, learning more than a maid is supposed to know. Let me tell you about the king who became a monster, and the woman 38 tries deep into a slaughter who simply refused to run. The chamber was dark, the way a held breath is dark. Not empty, just waiting. Fia stood inside the door for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, and the smell hit her first. Wet animal, old copper, something underneath both of those that she couldn't name yet, but would later understand was simply grief, gone rancid from having nowhere to go. She heard him before she saw him, a sound low in a chest big enough to make the floor hum with it. Then movement, something enormous shifting in the dark at the far curve of the wall. Claws finding stone. A presence assembling itself out of shadow the way a storm, the way it assembles itself out of still air. He came into the torchlight slowly, the way a thing does when it already knows. It doesn't need to hurry. 7 feet of him if he stood. He wasn't standing. Fur black going to silver gray down his spine, a ridge of it raised along his shoulders, and eyes that were the wrong color for an animal, too aware, too tired, gold gone dull like a coin that spent years at the bottom of a well. 37 people had looked at that and felt their whole bodies turn to instruction. Run, fight, scream, pray. Fia looked at it and felt something closer to recognition. She walked to the center of the room, the only piece of floor not stained dark with old use, and sat down, cross-legged, hands open on her knees. Like she'd come to wait out a storm under an awning, not face down whatever had ended 37 lives in under 4 minutes apiece. The beast went still, not the careful, coiled stillness of a predator deciding the angle of a strike. A different stillness, confused stillness. His head dropped, his great shoulders rolled forward. And for 3 full breaths nothing in the room moved at all except the torches, throwing his shadow huge and shaking against the curved wall. He had only ever known 2 things to enter that door: fear and the violence fear makes when it's cornered. He had 37 memories of that, and not one memory of anything else. Fia didn't run. She didn't even flinch when he took a step toward her, slow, testing, head low the way a dog tests a hand it doesn't trust yet. She watched him come and her shoulders didn't climb to her ears, and her breath didn't catch. And somewhere behind that enormous skull, something that used to be a man tried, for the first time in longer than he could count, to understand what he was looking at. "You're not going to fight me," he said. Or it said. The voice came out wrong, gravel dragged through a throat shaped for howling. But the words were words, and that alone made Hesh outside the door go rigid against the oak, because in 9 years he had never once heard that thing speak. "No," Fia said. "Then run." "No," he huffed, a sound that in a smaller animal might have been a laugh. In him came out closer to a small earthquake. "Everyone runs." "I'm tired," Fia said, and it was the truest thing she'd said in months. "I came in here to stop running. You can do what you're going to do. I'm not going to make it a chase." He circled her. Once, twice, close enough that she could feel the heat off him, the displaced air, close enough to smell wet fur and underneath it. She noticed this and filed it away without understanding it yet. the faint copper and wood smoke smell of a man who hadn't bathed in something other than rage in a very long time. His claws clicked against stone an arm's length from her knee. She didn't move. Circling. He sat. Across from her. An enormous blackensill shape, folding itself down onto the cold floor, the way a body folds, when it's finally given permission to stop holding itself up. And the torches guttered, and outside the door, Hesh let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding for 9 years, because the sound that should have come, that had come 37 times, didn't come at all. "What's your name?" the beast said, low, rough, like the question cost him something to ask in a voice he didn't trust to be heard. "Fia. They send pretty names in to die," he said. "Mine was Edric before." "Before what?" He didn't answer that. His head dropped lower, jaw nearly to the floor, eyes still on her, gold and exhausted, and she noted this too, filed it beside the smell of wood smoke, wet at the rims in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "You should be screaming," he said. "I don't have any left," Fia said. "I used it all somewhere else." Outside, Hesh was already moving, fast, quiet, down the corridor toward the steward's tower, because something had happened in that chamber that hadn't happened in 9 years, and word like that doesn't wait for morning. It reached the wrong ears first. Lord Cassian Bray heard it before the king's own council did, because Cassian Bray made it his business to hear everything in that castle before anyone official did, and what he heard, standing in his silk dressing robe at an hour no lord should be awake, made the muscle under his left eye twitch. A tick that only showed when his profit margins were threatened, and everyone who'd ever played cards with him for money had learned to watch for it. "She's still alive," he said. "Sitting with him," the runner said. "Talking. He's not, Lord Bray, he's not doing anything." Cassian Bray had built 11 years of comfortable income on the existence of a controllable monster. Challengers paid entry fees that filled coffers he personally oversaw. Nobles paid handsomely to watch from the gallery slot above the chamber. A private viewing he'd carved into the architecture himself, and never once mentioned to the crown treasury. A king too feral to rule meant a council too necessary to dismiss, and Cassian Bray sat at the right hand of that council, and had for 9 very comfortable years. A king who could be calmed was a king who might, eventually, remember how to sign a writ. "Get the council together," he said, and his voice was even, pleasant even. The voice of a man who has already decided something and is simply choosing which smile to wear while he does it. Quietly. "I told you I wasn't in every room. I wasn't in that one. But I've worked in enough castles since to know exactly what that kind of quiet meeting looks like, and I can promise you it never once, in the history of quiet meetings, ended with anyone's good fortune but the man who called it." She went back the next night. Nobody made her. That's the part the kitchen staff still talk about, low, when the steward's not in earshot, that after the first night, when the guards opened the chamber door expecting to carry out what was left of her, and found her instead walking out on her own 2 feet, pale but whole, nobody told her to return. She came back the way you'd return to a house you'd started, against your own better judgment, to think of as something close to your own. The beast was waiting in the same place. Not pacing. Not pressed flat to the wall the way the guards usually found him before a challenger came in. Sitting. The way she'd left him, like he'd held the position the whole day rather than risk losing whatever had happened between them. "You came back," he said, and there was something in the rough drag of his voice that hadn't been there the night before. Not quite hope. Hope was too big a word for a creature that hadn't trusted the shape of the world in years. Closer to the smallest possible crack in a door. "I said I would. Nobody keeps that kind of promise to me." She sat across from him again. The same distance, the same open hands on her knees. "I do." He studied her in the torchlight, really studied her the way Hesh, watching through the small barred slot in the door, realized he had never once seen the beast look at anything, Looking before had always been hunting. This was different. This was a man relearning the shape of a face. "Your scar," he said. "Who gave it to you?" Fia's hand found her own collarbone without her quite meaning it to, fingers resting near the old silver's line of it. "Someone who decided I was his to mark. Is he dead?" "No." "Do you want him to be?" She was quiet a long moment. The torches popped. Somewhere above them, in a slot in the wall disguised as decorative stonework, a shadow shifted that neither of them noticed. Cassian Bray, come to see for himself what the runner had reported, his pale eyes narrow in the dark, the muscle under his left eye twitching once, twice. "I used to," Fia said finally. "Now I mostly just want to stop flinching when men raise their voices." The beast made a sound low in his throat, not quite a growl, something gentler and more broken than that. "I raise mine. Every day. I can't always stop it. I noticed you didn't raise it with me." "I don't know why," he said, and for a moment the gravel in his voice cracked clean through, and what came out underneath sounded almost young. "I don't know what you're doing to me." "I'm not doing anything," Fia said. "I'm just not leaving." He moved then, the first time he'd closed the distance between them since she'd sat down the second night. One massive paw sliding forward across the stone, slow enough that she could have pulled back, slow enough that it was clearly a question and not a claim. It stopped a hand's width from her knee. She looked at it. She looked at him. She didn't pull away. She didn't reach out either. Not yet, the gap holding. Both of them aware of exactly how much closer that paw had come, and exactly how far it still was from touching her. And something about that restraint, about the fact that neither of them crossed it, made Hesh outside the door grip the hilt of his sword, for no reason he could have explained. Like he was watching something more dangerous than a fight. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" the beast said. "I think," Fia said slowly, like she was working it out for herself in real time, "that you're the first thing in a long while that's looked at me and wanted something other than my fear." He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. His paw stayed where it was, close, patient, and the torches burned low. And above them in the dark, a man in a silk robe made a decision about what to do next. What the court wanted, you have to understand, was never the truth. It was the arrangement. A king too far gone to govern was a council with all the power and none of the blame, and for 9 years that arrangement had run like a well-oiled cart. Feed the beast, chain the beast, sell tickets to watch the beast take apart whoever was desperate or brave or foolish enough to walk through that door and let the gallery seats above the chamber fill. With the kind of nobles who paid in gold to feel the particular thrill of watching someone else's ruin from a safe height. Nobody in that gallery had ever once asked whether the man inside the beast might still be reachable. It hadn't been a useful question. It was Cassian Bray who first said out loud, to the 6 other lords gathered in a chamber 2 floors above the one where Fia now sat most evenings, that the girl was a problem. "She's reaching him," said a woman at the far end of the table. Lady Orsana Thieve, a thin, sharp-jawed noble with a streak of pure white through otherwise black hair. The result, she liked to say when asked, of a fright she refused to describe. "That's the whole point of her, apparently." "Should we not want that?" "Want it," Cassian Bray said, "and we lose every coin this arrangement brings in. A king who rules doesn't need a council to rule for him. A king who rules asks questions about ledgers. He let that sit. I, for one, do not enjoy questions about ledgers." There was a silence around the table that told him most of them shared the feeling, even if none of them wanted to be the one who said it plainly. "She's nothing," Bray went on. "No house, no name worth the ink to write it. We remove her quietly. The king goes back to what he was, the arrangement holds. Nobody asks anything of anyone." "And if he doesn't go back," Orsana said, "if the calm holds without her, what then?" Bray smiled, the kind of smile that had never once meant anything good for the person it was aimed near. "Then we'll have learned something useful about how replaceable she was." They voted. It wasn't unanimous. Orsana's hand stayed in her lap a long moment before she finally quietly raised it, and something about the way she did it suggested she'd remember the moment longer than she wanted to. But it was enough. Fia didn't know any of this yet. She only knew that on the 7th night, when she crossed the inner courtyard toward the chamber corridor, 2 guards she didn't recognize fell into step a little too close behind her, and that one of them had a hand resting on his belt in a way that had nothing to do with formality. She'd learned a long time ago in a life she didn't talk about to notice that kind of thing. She kept walking. She didn't run. Running, she'd learned that night too, was its own kind of invitation. Edric, she'd started thinking of him by that name now, in her own head, even when the gravel in his throat still made it come out, wrong, when he tried to say it himself, was waiting in the same place when she came through the door. He lifted his great head, and something in his nose found her before his eyes did, and the low constant sound that had filled that room for 9 years. The kettle left on the fire sound, dropped half a register the moment he caught her scent. "You're frightened," he said. "A little. You weren't before. There were guards in the courtyard tonight that don't usually walk that route," she said, sitting across from him in the place that had become, without either of them naming it, hers. "I don't think they were there for the air." Something changed in him at that. Not the loosening she'd come to expect over these past nights. The gradual unclenching of a body that had been braced for violence for longer than memory. The opposite. His shoulders rose. The ridge of fur along his spine lifted. A low sound built in his chest that she hadn't heard since the first night, and for one cold second, she wondered if she'd been wrong about everything, if the calm she thought she'd built was about to undo itself in front of her. "Who," he said, and the word came out half growl, half human fury, "sent them?" "I don't know." "Find out," he said, and then, almost immediately, like the order had cost him something to give in that voice, softer, "Please." It was the please that did it. Not the size of him, not the claws or the teeth or the 9 years of bodies that Fleur had seen. The please, rough and unpracticed, like a man relearning a word he hadn't needed in a very long time because nobody had ever given him reason to ask rather than command. "I will," she said. He didn't move closer that night. He stayed where he was, watching her with that gold gaze gone sharp now instead of dull, and when she left, early this time, the unspoken evening cut short by the cold thing now sitting between them. He made a sound low and unhappy in his throat that she felt more than heard, all the way down the corridor. She found out 3 nights later, and not because anyone told her plainly. Nobody in that castle told servants or strangers or nameless women anything plainly. She found out because Hesh, the guard captain with the missing ear, caught her arm in the shadow of the kitchen stair and spoke fast and low, like a man unburdening something he'd been carrying too long. "Bray's behind it," he said. "The council voted. Quiet removal. An accident. They're calling it something that won't trace back. There's coin moving for it. I've seen the ledger entries myself, disguised as kitchen stores, but I know what they are. Why are you telling me this?" Hesh's jaw worked. The scarred pucker where his ear should be caught the torchlight oddly. "Because I watched 37 people die in that room and told myself it wasn't my business to feel anything about it. I don't want to tell myself that again." Fia nodded once. She didn't thank him. Gratitude, in that world, had a way of being remembered against you later, but something in her face must have shown him enough, because he let go of her arm and stepped back into the shadow like he'd never been there at all. She should have gone straight to the chamber. She should have told Edric everything. That night, plainly, the way she'd promised. She didn't. She told herself it was strategy, that walking in frightened and certain of her own death would only unsettle the fragile, hard-won calm they'd built together, that it was kinder to wait, to gather more, to be sure before she put that weight on him. She told herself a dozen reasonable things on the walk to her small room off the kitchen corridor. And every one of them was, in its own quiet way, a lie she was telling, so she wouldn't have to watch his face break. It cost her 2 days. 2 days in which Bray's plan moved further along than it would have if she'd spoken the moment she knew. 2 days that would matter more than she understood yet. And when the moment finally came, 3 nights later, faster and uglier than anyone in that chamber was ready for, that small, human, forgivable failure of nerve would be the reason there wasn't time to do this carefully. It is, I think, the only thing about her you could ever fairly call a fault. She wasn't a saint who walked in calm and never wavered. She was a woman who'd been hurt enough to know exactly how much truth a person can carry before it breaks them, and she misjudged, once, how much he could carry. Because she wanted, just for 2 more nights, to give him something gentler than the truth. He found out anyway. Not from her. He smelled it on her the next time she came. Fear, fresh and sharp, layered over the fear from before. And beneath both of those, something that made his blood go cold in a way violence never had. The particular scent of a person who is keeping something from someone they care about in order to protect them. "You're hiding something," he said. Before she'd even sat down. "Edric, say it." So she did. All of it. Bray, the coin, the word accident written in a ledger disguised as kitchen stores, the 2 days she'd spent deciding not to tell him. The sound that came out of him then was not a sound Hesh, outside the door, had ever heard from anything living. Not quite a roar. Something lower and worse. Grief and fury braided together so tight there was no separating them. And the floor under Fia's knees actually trembled with it. And for one terrible heartbeat she thought she had finally, after 7 careful nights, undone everything. Then he did something none of the 37 had ever lived long enough to see. He put his head down. Not in submission, in something closer to collapse. The great weight of him folding forward until his skull rested against the stone an inch from her knee, and the sound coming out of him now wasn't rage at all. It was closer to weeping, if a creature that size could weep, raw and unashamed and 9 years overdue. "They've always controlled what I am," he said into the floor, muffled, broken. "The chains, the chamber, the challengers they send in to remind me what I'm for. I thought, as I let myself think, for 7 nights, that this was mine, that you were mine to want without it costing someone something." Fia's hand moved before she'd decided to let it. It hovered an inch above the dark fur of his skull, the same gap that had sat between them all these nights, the same restraint, except now it was her crossing it. Finally, after 7 nights of neither of them daring to be the one, and then she let it land, light, careful. The first deliberate touch either of them had allowed since this began. He went very still under her hand, stiller than stillness, like a man holding his breath against the fear that the moment would prove itself a trick of starvation. "It is yours," she said, quiet. "I should have told you sooner. That's mine to be sorry for. But this?" Her hand pressed slightly, steadying against the warmth of him. "This is yours. Nobody gave you this. You're the one who sat down across from me instead of taking what every other night taught you to take." He lifted his head, slow, until the gold of his eyes found hers at close range for the first time, close enough that she could see the wet at the rims wasn't only grief now. "Bray will try again," he said, "sooner. Now that he knows I know." "Then we don't wait for him to choose the night," Fia said. And something in her voice had changed too. Not fear gone, but fear with a spine in it now, fear that had decided to stop being only a thing that happened to her. It happened 4 nights later, and it happened in daylight, which was its own kind of insult, because daylight was supposed to be safe. Bray didn't come himself. Men like Cassian Bray rarely do. He sent 6 men dressed as kitchen staff, carrying trays that held, under linen cloths, things sharper than bread knives, and he timed it for the hour Fia crossed the courtyard alone to bring the beast his evening meal, a task she'd taken on herself weeks back, gently, the kitchen staff letting her without question because something about her had earned that kind of quiet trust. She heard them before she saw them. That was the only reason she was still breathing 30 seconds later. A scrape of boot leather wrong for kitchen staff, the particular hush of men trying too hard to look unhurried. She didn't run. Some old instinct, sharpened over 7 nights of sitting still in front of something that could have killed her in a heartbeat, and chose, every time, not to, told her that running was exactly what these men were built to catch. She turned, instead, toward the chamber door. "Edric," she said, not loud, but pitched to Carrie. And the door, the 3-inch oak and iron door that had held 9 years of horror inside it, that no challenger had ever once managed to so much as crack, shuddered on its hinges like something enormous had thrown itself against the other side with the whole of its weight. What the court had built over 9 years was a controllable monster. What they had never once accounted for was a man inside that monster who had, after 9 years of being given nothing to fight for, finally been given something. The door didn't hold. He came through it in a way that should not have been physically possible for hinges, forged that thick, and the 6 men in their kitchen staff disguises had perhaps half a second to understand what they were looking at before understanding stopped mattering. He didn't kill them. I want to be honest with you about that, because the story gets told sometimes, like he tore through them the way he'd torn through challengers. And that's not what Hesh told me. And Hesh was the one who came running at the sound and saw it with his own eyes. He didn't need to kill them. 7 feet of black and silver fury, claws raking stone instead of flesh, a roar that brought guards from 3 corridors over. That was enough. 5 of the 6 were on the ground, weapons scattered before they'd so much as drawn them. The 6th ran and didn't stop running until he was well outside the castle walls, and was never seen in that province again. Fia stood in the middle of it, untouched, and when the beast turned back to her, chest heaving, eyes wild in a way she hadn't seen since the first night, she didn't flinch. "I'm all right," she said. He didn't seem to hear it, not at first. He was pacing, circling her, the old aggression rising in him like floodwater. 9 years of being a weapon for other men's purposes finding, for the first time, a use he'd chosen for himself, and the line between protecting her and simply being what they'd made him stood very thin in that moment. "Edric." She said it the way she'd said it the first night. Not loud, not commanding, just steady. "Look at me, I'm here, it's done." It took him 3 full breaths to come back from wherever the violence had taken him. 3 breaths, his great head swinging toward her, the gold of his eyes finding her face and holding there, and slowly, the way ice gives in spring, not all at once but in 100 small cracks, the rigid fury went out of his shoulders. He sat. Beside her this time, not across. The first time he'd chosen that, close enough that his flank pressed warm against her side, and she felt, more than heard, the low rumble in his chest settle from something violent into something almost like the sound a man makes when he's finally allowed to stop bracing. By the time Hesh and a dozen guards arrived, what they found was not a slaughter. It was a chamber doorframe in splinters, 5 disarmed men groaning on the flagstones, and a king's monstrous second self sitting in broad daylight beside a woman with no house and no name, neither of them moving away from the other. Cassian Bray was resuscitated within the hour, not by guards loyal to him, who suddenly found their loyalty had evaporated the moment it became clear which way the wind in that castle had turned, but by Hesh himself, who walked into Bray's chambers, without knocking, and found the man already half-packed, a small chest of gold open on the bed. "Going somewhere?" Hesh said. Bray's smile didn't waver, not at first. Men like him have a great deal of practice keeping a smile in place past the point it should have failed. "There's been a misunderstanding." "There's a ledger," Hesh said. "Disguised as kitchen stores. I told her about it myself, 3 nights back. I imagine she's mentioned it to him by now." The smile finally went. What was underneath it was something smaller than Bray had ever let anyone see. The trial, if you could call it that, Since nobody in that court was inclined to extend Cassian Bray the kind of patience he'd never once extended to 37 dead strangers. Took less than an hour. Edric attended in human form. The first time in 9 years he'd stood in that hall as a man rather than a rumor, and the sight of him alone, tall, dark-haired, a face gone gaunt with years of grief but undeniably, unmistakably a king, silenced the room before he'd said a word. Bray tried, near the end, to appeal to history. To 9 years of service to the crown, to an arrangement that had, in its way, kept the kingdom functioning while its king was lost to himself. "You kept me chained," Edric said in his voice, human now, but with a low gravel under it that would never fully leave, a permanent reminder of 9 years spent as something other than a man. "Didn't rise. It didn't need to. You sold tickets to watch what was left of me tear people apart, and you called it an arrangement. You're right that it kept things functioning. It kept your coffers full. It kept me alone." He paused. "I know something now about being alone that I didn't know 9 years ago. I know it's the only thing that ever made me dangerous. Bray's exile was the mercy. The court would have preferred worse, and said so, loudly. But Edric, and this, I think, is the part of him that mattered most. The part that proved whatever Fia had reached in that chamber hadn't been only a softening, but something closer to a man rebuilding a conscience from the inside out. Refused. "He doesn't get to make me a killer too," he said. Quiet enough that only the front rows heard it, and Fia, standing near the back of that hall in a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit her, heard it clearest of anyone, and something in her chest, long since gone numb to hoping for things, allowed itself, just slightly, to hope. Lady Orsana Thieve, the woman with the white streak through her hair, came to find Fia 2 days later, in the kitchen corridor, where Fia still mostly slept out of habit rather than any sense that she'd earned a different room. "I voted for it," Orsana said, without preamble, without softening it. "The council vote. I want you to know I voted for it, and I've spent 2 nights trying to decide whether to tell you that or simply let you never find out." Fia studied her for a long moment. "Why tell me?" "Because I think you're the only person in this castle who'd actually want the truth instead of the comfortable version of it," Orsana said. "And because my hand shook when I raised it." "That's not an excuse. I raised it anyway. But it shook. It wasn't an apology, not quite. Orsana Thieve didn't strike Fia as a woman who apologized easily, the streak of white in her hair sitting like a flag, for whatever old fright had taught her to be careful rather than kind. But it was honest. And after 9 years of a court built on comfortable arrangements, honest was its own rare currency. "Thank you for telling me," Fia said, and meant it, and let the woman go without offering forgiveness she didn't yet have to give. The thing nobody warns you about in a story like this is that the chamber door doesn't stop being there once the monster is gone from behind it. It still stands at the end of that corridor, scorched faintly at the hinges where it gave way under 9 years of pressure, finally released in one afternoon, and Fia found herself walking past it more often than she meant to in the weeks that followed, the way you keep touching a healed wound just to make sure it really has closed. Edric found her there once, a month after Bray's exile, standing in front of the splintered frame with her hand resting flat against the old oak. "You don't have to come back to this corridor," he said. "There are other halls, now. Better ones. I know. Then why are you here?" She didn't answer right away. The torches in that corridor still burned low. Some habits a castle keeps without meaning to, and in their light the silver scar at her collarbone caught the same way it had the very first night. The night 37 challengers were already cold names in a ledger, and she walked in with nothing left to lose. "Because I want to remember what it cost," she said finally. "Both of us. I don't want it to become a story I tell where the hard part disappears." He came to stand beside her, close enough now that it cost neither of them anything to let their shoulders touch, a closeness that, 4 months earlier, had taken 7 careful nights and a doorframe in splinters to earn, and for a while neither of them said anything else at all. "Marry me," he said eventually, and it came out plainer than a king's proposal probably ought to. Rough-edged, unpracticed, the same way please had sounded the first time he'd asked her for anything. Not because the bond says I should. Not because the court needs an heir or a story to tell about how the monster was tamed. Because you sat down across from me when you had every reason to run, and you never once asked me to be less than what I actually was, even at my worst, and I don't know how to want anything the way I want that to keep being true. Fia was quiet long enough that a lesser man might have flinched. She didn't make him wait out of cruelty. She'd never once. In all those nights, used silence as a weapon. She was simply doing what she always did, which was deciding honestly rather than answering out of relief or obligation or the easy gravity of a story that wanted a tidy ending. "I'll marry you," she said finally, "because I want to. Not because you're a king, and not because some old bond decided it for us before either of us had a say. I want to wake up and choose this again tomorrow, and the day after the way you chose to sit down instead of fight that very first night, even though every part of you had been trained to do the opposite." It wasn't the speech a balladeer would write. There was no swelling music, no court assembled to witness it, just two people standing in a scorched corridor in low torchlight, her hand still resting against the old oak door, his hand coming to rest, finally, over hers. And that, more than any grand declaration, was the whole of what they'd built. Not a claim, not a curse broken by a kiss, but a choice repeated, ordinary, theirs. I still work in that castle, for what it's worth, though I don't scrub the chamber floor anymore. Nobody does. Because nobody's sent through that door in chains to be torn apart for the entertainment of men who profit from someone else's fear. They turned the room into something else eventually. A hall for petitioners, I heard. Plain stone benches where anyone, lord or servant, can come sit and be heard by their king without an appointment or a fee. I think about that sometimes, when I pass it. How the same room that swallowed 37 people whole became, eventually, a place built entirely around the idea of sitting down and being listened to. I think about her too, the woman with the scar at her collarbone, who walked in on a foot that didn't shake, with nothing left to lose and nothing to prove, and simply sat. Everyone who tells this story wants to make her brave in some grand, gleaming way, the kind of bravery that gets carved into statues. I don't think that's quite right. I think she was just tired enough of running to finally stop, and it turned out that stopping, staying, steady, present, when every instinct in the room around her screamed to flee, was the one thing nobody had ever offered him before. He wasn't a monster. He was a man nobody had been brave enough, or kind enough, or simply willing enough, to sit beside. She sat beside him anyway. That's the whole of it, really. That's why I still tell this story to anyone who'll stand still long enough to hear it, bucket or no bucket in my hand. 37 people went through that door, believing the only way out was to win. The 38th understood, somehow, before she ever crossed the threshold, that the only way out was never to fight what was waiting. It was to stay.